Okay, I'm sorry for the delay. We had to get clearance from Langley, and it took some time to get the clearance, but it's sad. I'm in good company. I mentioned a couple of names to get this going. What I would like to do today is to make an argument and to present you with some material to illustrate the argument. The key is to illustrate rather than to test it in any kind of formal way. The first two slides are teasers. I normally use them for European audiences. And the third slide will present the core argument, and subsequent slides are designed to illustrate the core argument. So the faculty rate is American as apple pie. Many an American university has built itself by raiding faculty from other places. In my last 5 years malfunctioning as associate dean, I discovered that Stanford actually has a line item where it actually has funds exclusively for the purpose of recruiting, which would be raiding, or protecting ourselves from raids. But I remind Europeans that the first recorded instance of an attempt to raid a faculty, a bold attempt to raid an entire faculty, was way back in the 13th century when Henry III attempts to recruit the University of Paris. Okay? Now, in all fairness, you really can't talk about this as the English king trying to recruit a French university. Because the idea that in the 13th century you have an England or a France requires a stretch of the imagination. So the communication is in Latin. In some ways, this is a world that is more cosmopolitan than the world of the 19th century, in the sense that people are transcending national boundaries because those boundaries have not been put in place. By way of contrast, here we have a letter from the incoming president of the University of Chicago to the president. It basically says, we don't like them foreigners. Okay, we shouldn't have some German running an American university or an American department. We really don't much like that, and it's uncomfortable. Remember, by the beginning of the 20th century, we have had nation states. They've been formalized. Benedict Anderson's imagined community has trumped. Okay? Of course, the irony here is that by less than 100 years later, they have a dean of the law school called Gerhard Casper, who is German, and subsequently became the provost, and subsequently became the president of the Stanford University. Yeah, it's the same thing. President of Stanford University, and makes the argument that the only reason he was asked to be the president is because he could correctly pronounce the motto of the university, which in English means "Let the winds of freedom blow." So, the core argument I want to make is that universities are changing. And I use the word universities as a shorthand for systems of higher education. And they're changing from historically rooted national institutions to organizational actors that are supposed to be more accessible, more entrepreneurial, and more professionalized in their organization and management. Now, I'm not here selling this. I'm not saying this is good. I'm not saying this is bad either. There are both proponents and critics. I'm trying to highlight what I think is happening, and I'm going to try to explain why I think this is happening. The term organizational actors is lifted from your Crooken's work, and what distinguishes organizational actors from historical institutions or historically grounded institutions is that organizational actors tend to have explicit goals and plans with which to attain those goals. In my concluding point, I'll remind everyone exactly what that means. But it varies. We don't think of families as organizations because we don't assume that families draft goals and plans to attain those goals. It'll be awkward if I told you that the family was consulting to find out what their core values are so they can then transform them into a vision, which will then inform their mission. Are you still with me? Which will then lead to a strategic plan and milestones of assessment. Okay, but that's what's happening in universities, and it used not to be that case. Okay, so that's the first point. And the second point is that I think these changes reflect the degree to which universities are influenced by an idealized model university that is dramatized by world-class metaphors and transnational rankings, disseminated by consultants, and portrayed as portable practices. So that's the core argument I'm making, and some of it resonates with remarks that were made yesterday on the second point regarding universities. First thing I want to point out is that universities have expanded enormously. There have been more universities after World War II, created after World War II, than in the history of humankind before that. It's pretty amazing when you think about, what has happened in the last 70 years or so. Some of them were created de novo, others were colleges that became universities, polytechniques that became universities. Every country wants to have a university, and it's a big thing. The number of university students has also expanded in relative terms. You can get different curves depending on how you measure this, but you're always going to get this rather interesting spike in the post-World War II era. That's the point I want to make. This is incidentally driven in good part by women's share of higher education, which has expanded throughout the world, including in Saudi Arabia. And if women decided they did not want to go into higher education, we'd have a real crisis as opposed to the ones that we always claim to have, okay? Because they're driving this process in terms of enrollments. More importantly, ideas that this was a disaster have been outcompeted. That doesn't mean the ideas are bad, they just are being outcompeted. 1971, in an issue of Minerva, Edward Shields writes an essay called No Salvation Outside Higher Education. I remember it because I cited it in my dissertation. Everything else begins to fade, but you never forget what you put in your dissertation. And the World Bank was formally committed to curbing the growth of higher education. There was a sense that there was too many. And some of you may remember an economist of the Hoover Institute who wrote The Overeducated American. So that was a real concern. We were in the era of manpower planning. The economy needed only so many people in higher ed, and there were too many people going on, okay? And that ideology has been outcompeted by an ideology that basically says everyone should be going to higher education. Education is for everyone. Occasionally, once in a while, someone writes to the contrary, but we tend to pretend that that was not something we'd like to hear. This is another paper I cited in my dissertation, and I assume that nobody has heard about it. Ben David and Zlogzauer, basically they're looking at different models of universities, and they're doing the French, the German, the English, the American. I want to simplify and look at one crucial distinction they make, and it's a distinction between what they call the more socially embedded university and the more socially buffered university. And what's crucial to that distinction is that the more embedded university has permeable boundaries between the university and society, whereas the more buffered university has more difficult to penetrate boundaries. And I'm talking about boundaries between the university and all kinds of interest groups. And very early on, the American university is a good example of a university that's socially embedded. Lots and lots of different interest groups are involved, and this gets celebrated by Burton Clark in his book, The Entrepreneurial University. American universities are very much looking for extra sources of resources, and it gets critiqued by Sheila Slaughter in her book, Academic Capitalism. But there's really quite a bit of consensus that American universities were much more interacting with different parts of society than the socially buffered university, in which, for example, the Germans would be a good case, in which, for example, engineering was really not thought of as a proper subject for universities. So you have the rise of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, subsequently called the Max Planck Institutes, and they are responsible for the development of applied chemistry that was very much pushing the dye industry in Germany. But it was those separate institutes. They were not really universities, okay? We, of course, are the country that subsequently invented things like women's studies, gender studies, race and ethnic studies, environmental studies, and this, you should know, has diffused throughout the world. You can do gender studies at Oxford. You can do gender studies at Humboldt University. Okay? part of what's diffusing, I have argued, is this idealized American university, and therefore the idea, I'm sorry, I said the idealized model of a university, which sounds suspiciously like an American university, but if you call it American, you could not pretend that these are portable practices. If you say this is an abstraction, then presumably everybody can be like the abstraction. So what we have here is a quote from the alma mater of some of you. This is Harvard. This is Harvard 1906. Harvard in 1906 would not have been classified as one of the top 10 universities. Those would be in Oxford, Cambridge, and several German universities. But what you have here is a very intriguing sense of entrepreneurship. Think about it. 1906, he's already imagining competition between American universities and foreign universities. And which university is going to win? The university that is able to raise more free money. And what is free money? It's money that's not linked, that's not tied up to any one project. It's what every development officer in a university dreams of. Not money that's tied up to a building which will subsequently have maintenance costs. If you have to, you take it. But what you want is unrestricted funds. Okay? And at that particular point, Harvard did not have an advantage over a number of other universities. I mean, I thought until very recently that, well, it was just older. No, it didn't. It's this particular imagery that gets Harvard to where it is. Okay? So this is one example of very early entrepreneurial universities. And because I gave these remarks at the University of Hong Kong, I also quoted Chiang Kai-min, who I should point out had also been working at Harvard for some years, so the entrepreneurial spirit that sort of flooded him. And you can see the enthusiasm with which he talks about this. He says it moves academics out of the box fixed by government allocation. It puts the core values back to academic endeavors. It creates room for, I can't read the whole thing because I'm going to burst into tears, okay? But mainly you get the idea that this is a terrific thing, and we should be doing this. And of course, it comes out in a book on leadership for world-class universities. So we have accessibility. And we find out that throughout the world, universities are more accessible than they used to be. Systems of higher ed. Some universities will be difficult to crack, but as a whole, universities have expanded. And again, backtracking, in 1900, the percentage of Americans of a certain age who had a post-secondary degree was greater than in any other country. That's no longer the case now. So what has triumphed is this ideal of an open system of higher education. But the United States no longer leads. It's like 7th or 8th in the world. There are 7 or 8 other countries in which the percentage of a particular age group in the labor force with a college degree exceeds the United States. You can sort of think of who they are. The third point is the idea that it's really good to professionalize the management of the university. In some circles, it's assumed that the success of American universities, albeit we never use the word American, that the success of American universities is that they're well managed. And that's what turns them into world-class universities. That's what turns them into engines of economic progress. Okay? And what you have here, and I just want to highlight one thing here, is that we're looking at the Social Science Citation Index data, and we're observing, looking at European articles, not at Americans, but at European articles. We're observing that between 1991 and 2008, the percentage of these articles which focus on management or the quality of the university has increased. Now, some of those articles are not wild about it, but they all now realize this is a subject. In the field of comparative higher education, people are wrestling with how to organize the university to make it more effective. Okay? The Asians are all in. The Europeans, less so, although they can see the wave. So what does it mean to have good organization? How do we measure whether an organization is well managed? That's rather difficult to do. You can do it tautologically and look at certain results, but you don't know whether it's due to organization. And increasingly, what people fall back on is how professionalized is the organization. And the key to professionalization is certification. Okay? So the more you have professionals running the organization, the more you see it as a well-managed organization. And at the very least, what we should see is an expansion of organizational roles within a particular university. And here I give you a modest example from the Graduate School of Education. We don't have a school of theology, so we are probably the lowest status school. And this is 1986, the year before I showed up. And, you know, we have a dean, we have secretary. We no longer have secretaries at Stanford. I don't know if you are aware of that. The category secretary is dead. We have administrative assistants and senior administrative assistants, but not secretaries. Off to the right, we have a development officer. And the development officer has a development assistant and a secretary. That's about it for development. And somewhere in the middle, you'll see a computer manager. And you'll have a computer support graduate student, 2 of them. Okay? So this is what the organizational flow chart in 1986 looked like. There was a dean, there were 2 associate deans, one for academic affairs and one for financial and administrative affairs. We fast forward to the present world, the new and improved system. Okay, so we have now 2 associate deans for academic affairs, one for faculty, one for students, and 2 for external affairs, one to bring in the monies and one to distribute them. And we had no assistant deans. We have 3 assistant deans. Now, if you push me, I can justify each and every one of these positions. Okay? As the dean becomes more and more involved in fundraising, you need to have differentiated associate deans, one of whom will be responsible for running faculty meetings, somewhat, and one of whom will be responsible for students. Okay? But this is the way it looks like. Move to the right-hand side, you'll see that the associate dean, right in the middle we have external relations, we have an associate dean, and we have about 6 or 8 people working for that associate dean on external relations. It's big. And we, off to the left, we have what used to be called computers, and it's now ICE, and the person in charge of information has the title Assistant Dean and Chief Technology Officer. Okay, so you see the drift, the titles from different parts. Well, my point is simply, it's hugely expanded, it's hugely differentiated, it's more fleshed out. And this is just the School of Education. Believe me, this looks much more dramatic if we looked at the School of Business or the School of Law. Okay, and at the university level, of course, there would also be drama. World class. When did that term come from? I think if you looked at the United States in '65, people often compared American universities to other American universities. Ditto in Germany and ditto. Where's the idea that you can rank order different universities? My God, we don't even do that with respect to food, right? I mean, Michelin gives stars, but they don't say French #1, Thai #2, and you know, it's assumed that these are institutions reflecting their national culture and so forth, and consequently, you can't possibly rate them or measure them. All I want to dramatize is that the term was not much used until the last 10 years or so, okay, and it has gone up. I mean, if you do a Googlegram, or you can do it in various ways, but you will see a shift. And you will see a shift in just ordinary discourse. People will write emails and talk about a world-class university, a world-class this and a world-class that. So the idea is that this is fairly rankable, hierarchical. I always say, as long as Harvard is rated #1, there'll be some credibility. When some particular rating system drops Harvard, there'll be a crisis of confidence in all the rating systems. Okay? Spoken like a true Stanford man. And there is, of course, within each one of these countries, increasingly an interest in rating their particular universities. And you know, Germany does it, France does it. Germany is horrified because some of the first universities that win the Excellence Initiative are technical universities, not the old Humboldt. Okay? But you know, they adjust to that. And you have Saudi Arabia too. Okay? So you know, there's such a broad interest in rating universities all along the idea that they should be pursuing the holy grail of world-class universities. Okay? Needless to say, there are also consultants explaining to them how they should go about doing this. Part of the excitement is the assumption that universities are the key to economic development. This was not always the case. No one really thought that universities were the key to economic development 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. There were places where people were either trained for leadership, the old Oxford, Cambridge, or they were trained to land various kinds of jobs, the American system with the land grant acts and broad accessibility. But there wasn't the notion that these were key to economic development. Now you might say, well, they are because there's evidence that shows that's the case, stupid. But in fact, the evidence is shaky. And I make a living out of showing that. In fact, if you do a formal statistical analysis where you look at countries with highly expanded tertiary enrollments, fixed effects models, you know, the economist's dream, and you look, it's a little less shaky than you might, it's a little more shaky than you might imagine. It expands the service sector more so than the industrial sector. If you contrast India and Korea, India was doing a lot more things that were seen as having scientific value in terms of publications, but it wasn't growing as much as Korea. Okay? But there is widespread belief, and there was a time when there wasn't widespread belief. The World Bank was very cautious about this. Others were very cautious about this, and those words get linked together now: higher education and economic development. The presentation on Saudi Arabia is very much along those lines. We gotta train these Saudis. They gotta learn these skills. In the process, they may also develop some ideas that they make them a potential danger to the kingdom. But we're gonna put that aside, okay? This is a list of the transnational rankings. You should treat all of these things with great skepticism. Once a year, I'm invited to rank places I don't know. You know, I'm just being candid, and I don't do it. But you know, I know a lot about schools of education and sociology. But if you give me 100 countries, I don't know. I just plain don't know which is the top department of sociology in Bulgaria, for example. Okay. But nonetheless, I'm trying to give you a sense of how these ratings are compiled. They're compiled sometimes on the basis of indicators like how much have you published in science, published in English, but sometimes they also ask for opinions from people that they think have some expertise. And if they're asking me, they have fairly low standards. This is my alma mater. This is De La Salle in the Philippines. And it sends me an email. You know, often letters from the Alumni Association are designed to get you to walk through memory lane. Maybe they even have a picture of you. But this is more formal. They're basically saying, look, we're 392nd in the Times Higher Education Supplement. Is there anybody here from the University of Brennan? Because it's in my bucket list. I want to meet someone from the University of Brennan because they came in 393. We're ahead. Okay? And they also have it by region, 89th in the Asia Pacific. And they're the top-rated private university in the Philippines, which they're proud about because we have a perennial competitor called the Jesuits. And so that's where they're sending them. Okay? Okay. So my point is that even in the Philippines, you do get this involvement in this worldwide ranking of universities striving to be excellent. This is an email I got, and it's verbatim from the world's perhaps best-known multinational consulting firm, McKinsey. And I just want to call your attention to the language. What are the major trends occurring in education? What are the factors that make an educational system most successful, particularly in a small developing nation with an authoritarian regime? They didn't say that, but you know. Now, I did ask our #1 world traveler whether he had been to the Kingdom of Bahrain, and it turns out he hasn't. That doesn't mean that one of you hasn't been there. So some of you may have. If you were there clandestinely, perhaps not. It's the wrong time to bring it up. Okay, but I don't know anything about the Kingdom of Bahrain. Okay, I am not an expert in the Middle East, and I'm too old to assume that that this was sent to me and that I was one of an elite six. I bet you they sent it to a whole bunch of people. Okay, um, but think about it. Okay? What nations are achieving the most success? From whom can Bahrain learn? There's an image that this is a portable thing, that they can learn from some other country. They're not saying, give us a country with our history. Give us a country with our culture. Give us a country with our dominant religion. It's very abstract, okay? And the funny part is, all of you could answer this question. And don't feel so flattered because I say this to undergraduates, okay? But think about it, okay? You know, it's Bahrain. They want a successful, mostly successful in a small developing nation. I mean, what would you tell them?
Bolivia.
Did you say Bolivia?
Small, B.
With a mostly successful educational system? Okay. Yeah. Imagine that they are highly incentivizing you to give them an answer. No, I think most of us would end up with something like Singapore. Right up there. It doesn't take much. That's what I want to point out. You know, they want a successful educational system, and they want it to be a small developing. Okay, maybe you don't think it's developing anymore, but it was 25 years ago. And you know they want an authoritarian regime, okay? This is a world that I inhabit, a world of consultants. And I should quickly point out, they're not even offering me any money. They're just asking. Dear Comrade Ramírez, what do you think about this? Okay.
Hold out for money.
Huh?
Hold out for money.
Well, I was sort of hoping that the grace of God would come later. But, you know, sometimes hopes don't get materialized, Randy. In this world we have, and this is really the closest thing to the comment made by David yesterday about bill readings and the universities, okay? Which he is thinking of universities as historically grounded institutions. The Germans do philology, the English do literature. I'm not quite sure what the Americans do, because I think he overestimates the degree to which we had a canon historically. But it's very clear that the Germans and the English had a very distinctive kind of style. Okay? And this is his horror picture, that all of that is being eroded. And it's being eroded under the idea that there are these best practices. Okay? And that the best practices are acultural, and that the best practices are presented so that they no longer have to assume that you are a 5 minutes, 2 minutes, where are we?
Oh, I'm just, yeah, not long. Yeah.
I'm a very compliant kind of guy. Yeah. Give me 2 minutes, it'll be over in 2.
We'll say 2. Yeah.
Okay. So best practices for teaching, getting and administering research grants, managing departments and other units, diversifying. And in case you need help, there are always these workshops and seminars designed to help you. This one is from Cambridge, and it's engaging faculty to build an institutional culture of effective student learning assessment. I love the word stakeholders, which we've now come to assume as normal. There are all of these different stakeholders to the university. The demands of accreditors, government agencies, and other external stakeholders. That's one. Fundraising for deans. They provide you advice on how to do that. Okay, so you don't have to come up with it on its own. You can go there. Another thing about leadership and assessment, and this one here, I want to emphasize engagement and inclusion. So not surprisingly, offices of diversity are spawned in American universities. This one emphasizes development, and about 3/4 of the universities cited in the Carnegie classification system have an office of development. Not an alumni association that hopes that if Stanford beats Cal, everybody will be excited and come on. No, formalized. And we have a huge building here. We have an Arrillaga Center that is a huge building all dedicated to development. I bring in a lot of people to the first floor, and the first thing I tell them is, we have a spacing issue. We have a space crunch at Stanford. And they look at this and they go, are you kidding me? There's a huge empty space, okay? Depends on what you're looking for space for. Okay? I highly recommend the Arrillaga just for the architectural effect. We also, it turns out, have a council for advancement and support of education. This is the second, this is just one more slide. Over 3,000 members in 77 countries, regional offices in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And what's the goal? The goal is to teach universities how to professionalize fundraising. Back to Eliot, back to 1906. You have to have your core values have to be expressed in your vision, which informs your mission, which then facilitates your having a strategy. Okay, and they have offices all over the world, and this really exists. I mean, it's not a phantom operation. Okay? So people are learning, and they're learning from this Council for Advancement and Support of Education. If you think about what are the different routes that universities can take, on the one hand, they reflect, this is the last slide, on the one hand, they reflect their historical legacies. I'm not arguing that historical legacies are irrelevant. In organizational terms, sometimes people talk about organizational path dependencies. The first path you took informs what other paths you're going to take. What I am arguing is that increasingly universities are less influenced by that and more influenced by the environment within which they exist. And that environment is increasingly a global environment in which ideas about what constitutes an excellent university permeate different universities. So, am I arguing that everything American diffuses? No. The intercollegiate systems, which is the backbone of American higher education, let us be clear on that, does not diffuse throughout the world. The Germans are not, thinking that it'd be great for Humboldt to play soccer against a team in Bavaria, and the French don't do it either. That doesn't diffuse. The fantastic differences in salaries within a university, within a department, don't diffuse either. Okay, when I say this in Europe, they go, "Well, you're thinking about a private university." No. I said, you can get a public university, same department, and you can get two people and with roughly the same age profile and a $70,000 gap. It's at that point that the Europeans get really angsty. Okay, the Scandinavians really get angsty. And, I'm just pointing out reality. Okay, and it's a highly competitive market-like system. Okay, so those things don't happen. Service to the university is very much undervalued in American universities. When I get a young person saying, "What does it take to get tenure at Stanford?" Depending on my mood, I say walk on water. Or when I'm trying to be nicer, I say, well, you have to build a research profile. And I say, think of the research as the cake. The teaching is like the icing on the cake. If there's no cake, the icing's on the table, not so pleasant. And service is like a little cherry on the icing, okay? No more, no less. You cannot get that across in Korea or in Singapore. I mean, service is really important. Okay? So not everything diffuses. Okay? But the core argument I'm making is that the globalized university is attuned to university templates of excellence that emphasize accessibility. No more ideas about controlling entry into higher ed. Social usefulness, you put that in quotation marks, okay? Partly reflected in entrepreneurship and professional management and organization. And as universities globalize, they become more like organizational actors rather than as historically grounded institutions. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Absolutely world-class presentation. No, wonderful. And I want to remind everyone that world is our first name. So,
World-class.
Classers?
Absolutely fascinating. Bienvenido has a question. Oops.
There's now an issue on cost of education, and do you have a way, or have you considered where the point of one study, like being a doctor, for example, would be not practical because you cannot recoup the cost of education? You just, when you finish, cannot get a job at all. So is there any study doing that?
No, I think it varies enormously in what kind of university you're in. So when the provost at Stanford gets in front of the families and says, you shouldn't worry about what your children are majoring in, he can say, Fiorina majored in comparative literature, and where is she now? Yeah. Depending on your politics, there's an answer to that. But the point is, we have people who major in comparative literature, we have people who major in all kinds of things. The American system has never linked higher education that closely to the labor market. My son majored in English and has made a living out of being a computer scientist, a computer programmer, essentially. Okay? But it is true that at some point, the debt issue has to be addressed. And again, it's easy for some universities to do it because 40-some% of the people who are at Harvard or Stanford are on scholarships. Okay? But it's harder for other universities. There's maybe a handful of universities that can honestly say, we're admitting you need blind. Others have to construct a class, which interestingly enough often means affirmative action for people who can pay the full loan so that you can then do other things. And we don't think about affirmative action that way. But if you're a small liberal arts college, you want your deposits. And that's the name of, that's the term that an admissions office used in a book that did an ethnographic study of admissions office. You want X percentage of your coming class to pay full loan. And they would refer to them as the deposits. Okay? And with that, you can then worry about your football team. And in this case, it was a hockey team, which they referred to as the Canadians. Okay?
Go out my Canadians.
We do that in my school.
See?
Oh, yeah.
And so
The
forth.
Canadians, yeah. Excuse me? Yes, Anthony. Oh, I'm sorry, Ed and then Anthony.
Two brief questions. In your reference to universities globalizing, are you including the establishment of foreign campuses of the various universities, like NYU in the Gulf of, in the Persian Gulf, et cetera, and how that changes attitudes? Whether the people over there and how those campuses might influence the attitudes of the home campus. And the other question is, with reference to the 1906 President Eliot quote on Harvard. I think you said that Harvard wasn't Harvard yet in those days. But if it wasn't, why was it still attracting people, even the son of William and James Stanford, who enrolled their son in Harvard, even while he was, I think, in junior high or high school, and who bought a house in New York so that they would be able to travel to Boston or have them travel to Boston to New York for the season. And, of course, the future President Theodore Roosevelt, a New Yorker, went to Harvard in about the same period. Why was it then already a university of some renown?
What I said is Harvard would not make a list of top 10 universities in the world. There were no American universities in 1906 that would have made that. And when I said it didn't have a competitive edge, what I'm saying is if you looked at, and it's that particular paper, which I'd be happy to send you the PDF, their endowment was not as strong as the endowment at Columbia, not as strong as the endowment in Chicago. They did not have an endowment edge in 1906. This particular strategy really helped them get the endowment going. I don't have an answer to, well, how did they succeed in doing it? I know the means. The idea was we're going to get a lot of donors instead of relying on one big donor, because one big donor we have more leverage over many donors as opposed to one big donor. I mean, that was part of the strategy. The other part, in 1906, they were already talking about being transparent. So if you gave money, they would tell you where the money went to, how it was being used. The other part of the strategy that is just absolutely ingenious is every year they would show a deficit. That's what they would do. They'd go back to the people and say, hey, this is what we did with your money. We were able to construct this lab. We were able to attract these professors. But we're showing a deficit because it's expensive.
I think the
And that was
Titanic-
explicit.
I'll send out an appeal for funds.
What was that?
It's been months since I've done that.
Titanic helped also.
From the WAIS Development Office.
And the answer to the first question is, when I showed the graph on universities, I was not including this new development where a number of universities have international campuses. Okay, I was not including that. What is evident now is many universities, especially outside the United States, are in the business of internationalizing, because some of the rankings do give you points for the number of foreign students you have, and needless to say, that leads to games. So at the University of Hong Kong, they will include Chinese from the mainland as international students, or from Taiwan, or from But that is now very much. I mean, I will get a letter from a scholar from Scandinavia who says, "I want to come and be a visiting scholar and work with you." And person will very honestly say, as you know, in this day and age, internationalization is seen as an important feature of the development of a scholarly profile. Okay. So yes, internationalization is happening, but I wasn't including that. I do have a standalone paper that deals with that includes the percentage of international students. And we do have internationalization offices as well.
Anthony D'Agostino.
Yeah.
had a-
I don't know if this question is relevant, but there's a default perception that the professionalization of management means the deprofessionalization of faculty and instruction with the rise of faculty. It's different for the elite universities in your perception, in your view, or opposed to non-elite.
Yeah, I taught at San Francisco State for 14 years. Red badge of courage. I taught it for 14 years, okay? When I get introduced, I notice that gets elided. They just jump right away into, he finished at Stanford, he's teaching at Stanford, which would make perfect sense if I was in Oxford, where a lot of the people are simply, but the United States we don't like that. We like for people to spend some time outside before they come back. There is a difference. Internationalization at the elite universities is not about tapping into a new revenue stream. Internationalization in the elite universities is part of, we are the world, we are solving problems in the world, and the more elite the universities, the more high-flowing rhetoric about how they're going to solve. Now, for others, it's clearly a revenue stream. Okay, so Long Beach State and Portland State are going to be wired to Middle Eastern interests where they think we can, tap into this, and it's a revenue stream. It is not a revenue stream for a number of other places. When you give scholarships at the Ivy League, they often do not distinguish between whether you're coming from the United States or out of the United States. If we're going, if in the social sciences, doctoral students are almost always given 4 or 5 years of scholarship money, and they don't distinguish between whether you're an American or not.
One more, Seth. Did you have a question?
Yeah, but I don't want to, somebody else has one that maybe.
No, Seth, you're the one.
Okay. No, just follows from Ed's question. It's kind of a historical footnote. I'm not an expert in this area, but it kind of helps give us a whole historical impression. In terms of Harvard or other similar institutions during that period, I think the prestige and the heritage and tradition may have been as important for certain populations, or more so than technical academic productivity, if that makes sense. And we don't think of it that way nowadays.
Right, but even today, a number of people want their children to go to some places, regardless of what they think the quality of instruction is, because, quote, you'll network with the right people.
Yeah.
And MBA programs often are quite explicit. What you're buying is a network. Our network is bigger than their network. So that happens. I do want to make one little side point. Okay? When you do get the more socially embedded university, you're also going to get a rise in the legalization of the university, because conflicts of interest arise as you're trying to tap into different sources of revenue. What's the relationship with the School of Earth Sciences and Exxon at Stanford? Poor Berkeley, they went with BP, which has the more recent accident, and therefore they're a little smear. But this invites the legalization of the university. Now that's the route that the left emphasizes. Academic capitalism, you're in bed with industry, you're in bed with money, consequently you'll end up with, I mean, they don't do the consequence, but there's a second route to the legal rationalization of the university, and that's the one that is not emphasized by the left. It's emphasized by a certain kind of sort of conservative mindset, and it's the empowerment of individuals. All kinds of individuals are empowered. Students, younger professors, maybe not adjuncts yet, okay? Adjuncts of the world unite, we have nothing but their chains to lose. But so those are two different routes, and they both have as their unintended consequence the rise of the legalization of all kinds of issues. And if I've learned one thing over the last 5 years, is that lawyers are increasingly more important. I don't mean the law school. I mean lawyers working for the university. And you know, there's a good side to that. There's a bad side to that. But the days where I could just counsel someone and say, don't come up for tenure, because it's clear you're not going to come up for tenure, we'll give you an extra year. A very humane kind of reaction, and one that the university used to encourage, you know. Tell people that they're not going to make the tenure. They don't have to come up for tenure. You get an extra year. That gets very dicey in this particular era. It's called Tom Fener in the legal office. Yeah.
I've had the suits from Stanford call me.
For this?
Not for you, no, but for WAIS, so definitely, yes, for copyright and a few other things, but we're good now. Bert has a question. Bert's a academic and a lawyer.
Yeah, sort of. On both counts. The consulting thing is fascinating to me. And I think a lot of presentations, this is sort of the thing about our culture right now, the way that bureaucracies seem to need to generate consensus knowledge, numerical, if at all possible. Okay, so rankings founded on the kind of poll that you send around become truly surreal, ontologically, epistemologically, empirically. Any way you think about it for more than 12 seconds, it can't hold up. And yet we've industrialized that. And there seems to be something very, very strange about producing numbers that we know are not true. And I'm not quite sure where that goes, other than it sort of feeds the machine. But we're all participating.
Oh, yeah. But
Because we did it with football, and so we have to.
It's like virtual administration. I've thought about it funny. You know, you showed this beautiful graph where you've got chart A, and then 5 years later you've got chart B that's here. And I figure you could argue that when when it goes asymptotic vertically, you'll have perfect education when you stop.
Thank you.
Perfection. Thank you so much, Chiki.